Hello, good afternoon. Good to see you all today. Thank you for coming. My name is Greg Niemeyer. I'm the instructor for Creativity in Practice, Letters and Sciences course, and we're streaming this lecture today, which is a guest lecture by our guest speaker, Gail De Kosnik. We're streaming it publicly, so we're going to have cameras on the stage, of course, but also on the audience when there's questions that are being asked, just as a heads up. And for the students in the class, I wanted to mention that you can pick up your digital notebooks that Moleskine provided if you signed up for those today between 2 and 4. You can also pick up your book, Spy in the Struggle by Aya de Leon in the bookstore. So all that stuff is now available just in time for you. And with that, I'm going to move into our slides here. So indeed, our lecture today is Creativity in Practice, Queer Self-Making. And we're going to consider in our class how archives can inspire changes in somebody's awareness of their identity. And so that's a wonderful thing where looking back into the record allows you to think forward into the future. And so it's very transformative. And I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Gail De Kosnik, who's a dear colleague for over many years of intense collaborations and adventures, mostly at the Berkeley Center for New Media, which she currently directs with great success, and for a second term, actually, right? For an extended term. Just another year. Oh, okay, just another year, but still with extended play. Yeah. And so let me say a few things about Professor Gail De Kosnik. Of course, she's a professor in performance studies, and as I mentioned, the faculty director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, which really operates as a graduate center for bringing together people from many different disciplines to discuss the impact of new media on human experiences. But it also has an undergrad program, and so if you're interested in doing more outside of your major, just at the boundary between your major and some other thing that you're really interested in, the Berkeley Center for New Media really provides support for that. Gail has a very rich career, a PhD in comparative literature studies, literary studies from Northwestern University, but also, which I deeply respect, in between academic experiences, she had a career as a entrepreneur, starting a startup business in education and successfully bringing that to a exit strategy, and then coming back to academia because she felt ready for independent research. And I think it's really beautiful that she brings her real-world business experience back into the academic space as well and gets things done. I love that about you. And speaking of getting things done, she wrote a phenomenal book called Rogue Archives, Digital Cultural Memory and Media Fandom, in which she started to think about the cultural legitimacy of illegitimate archives, the cultural legitimacy of things that people do because they need to explore media on their own in some way that a corporation might not provide them access. Pirate archives do provide access, and so that's the rogue archive, the underground archive. And she wrote a very important book together with Keith Feldman called #Identity, hashtagging race, gender, sexuality, and nation. And this book was written much before, I think, the most recent wave of Black Lives Matter, and started establishing some of these patterns and dynamics of making things visible that were otherwise invisible through very tight messages that were very, very easy to repeat and scale. And Gail De Kosnik is also an expert on television, and I think has an archive of every show she ever watched, which is really impressive. And so you could create a sort of a map of somebody's consciousness based on all the things they've seen. And if you wanted to do that, you'd need the archive for that, and Gail has that exact archive. And so that's why she's also writing about soap opera transformations for a new media era. And I wanted to ask Gail what her favorite most recent shows were this summer, and it turns out it was Hacks, which is where is that, on HBO, and then also Lady Parts, which is on We Are Lady Parts, which is on Peacock, a British show. So if you want to hear these kinds of recommendations, maybe Gail will talk about it some more. So currently, Gail is writing a book called Fandom and Piracy. Her talk today, Queer Self-Making Through Pirate Porn Archives, is a chapter in that book, or going to be a chapter in that book. So maybe with your feedback, the chapter will actually change and transform a little bit. And at least when we do lectures, we often have this chance of thinking through our own work in dialogue with others, and that's exactly what's going to happen here. So Gail is one of the faculty co-organizers of a very important group called the Color of New Media, a working group that focuses on the overlap of critical race theory, gender and women's studies, and transnational studies with new media studies, sponsored by the Center for Race, Gender, with additional support from Berkeley Center for New Media. Gail is a Filipino American, and we're very proud to have her here and welcome her here today. So please join me in welcoming Gail De Kosnik. All right.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for Paris for helping to organize today, and to everyone who is helping and has helped with today. And as Greg said, this is going to be a chapter of my forthcoming book called Fandom and Piracy. And so I really appreciate the chance to share this emerging work with you, this work in progress, and it really will benefit from any questions or comments or thoughts or ideas for things I should take out. It'll benefit from anything that you have to share with me at the end of my talk. So please be thinking about anything you want to share, any advice you want to give me. So today we're talking about queer self-making through pirate porn archives, and I'm going to issue some care warnings right at the top. There will be references to homophobic discourse, although no quotes of homophobic speech. There will be references to pornography, but no images of frontal nudity. There will be explicit language about sex and sexual themes and profanity, and a brief reference to sexual violence against a minor described by one of my interviewees. No explicit descriptions, but please take care of yourself. If anybody feels like this is not the kind of content they can hear today, then I'll just, take up beat and feel free to exit. And there's absolutely nothing you need, no explanation you need to give to anybody for that. So these are my care warnings. Okay. So I want to just let you know that even though the title of this talk is Queer Self-Making Through Pirate Porn Archives, this lecture is not about pirate-themed porn, such as this 2005 pornographic film titled Pirates, clearly based on the blockbuster Pirates of the Caribbean movie franchise launched by Disney in 2003. So it's not about this. That would be a great lecture, though, but that's not what this lecture is. This lecture is about young people who performed queer self-making in part by accessing online archives of pirated LGBTQIA-themed porn. I'm going to be discussing 3 of my research team's interviewees. Matt H., who at the time of the interview was 24 years old, Asian American. These are all, by the way, identifiers that the interviewees themselves gave. So I'm just using their own terminology. Asian American, male, queer from the southeast of the United States and also from Oakland, who discovered a torrent tracker of queer-themed media, primarily porn, that I will pseudonymize as Gay Porn Archive, or GPA, in 2008 at the age of 15. And I pseudonymize a lot of the pirate archives that I refer to because I don't want them to be in any danger of being taken down or having legal notices like cease and desist notices given to them. Yes, Greg. Oh, a torrent tracker is if you go to a website that is a torrent tracker, it will look like a database that has names of television shows and films and video games, software, books that you might want to download. And you download what is called a torrent, which is a little file on your computer that if you use it correctly, I won't go through the protocol right now, but if you use it in the BitTorrent network, it will allow you to download the entire file from a bunch of other people in the network who are uploading the file at the same time. So the uploaders are called seeders, and you, the downloader, are able to assemble the whole book or the whole TV show or the whole film through the BitTorrent network from people who are uploading bits of it at a time. So that's what a torrent tracker is. It's basically a piracy website. But there are many kinds of piracy websites, so a torrent tracker is a specific one. Gilberto, another interviewee, was 22 years old at the time of this interview, Black, Caribbean, specifically Dominican Haitian, Black Latinx, male-ish, gay, queer beyond, from the Bronx, New York, and discovered pirated queer porn on social media platform Tumblr in 2012 at the age of 12. Oh, Greg, I'm sorry, I forgot to ask you, can I take off my mask, or what do you prefer? Or what's the protocol?
Hi, Greg. Sorry, BAM PFA policy, the masks have to stay on.
Okay, that's totally fine. Yep. Okay, and the third interviewee is Rex, 20 years old, Chinese, Asian, male, gay, a junior year undergraduate, illicitly downloaded gay porn images from various sites in 2014 at the age of 14. So each generation, meaning each generation in history, experiences sexual development in a specific historical context. The generation that I am studying, these three individuals, belong to the first couple of generations, the younger millennials and the older Gen Zers who came of age with the internet as an everyday technology. So I think that context of what generation we're talking about is important. In addition to being the first generations to grow up with ready access to a robust internet, millennials and Gen Zers also inherited the legacies of decades of public debates, anxieties, and fears over children's and teens' media usage and their sexuality. So this is an image from the 1920s, and this is an actual baby cage. There was a whole wave of parenting manuals that started to come out in the 1920s, and a large rhetoric around what will it take to raise moral children, good children. And constraint was a large part of that rhetoric about healthy parenting. So one thing that was advocated in the 20s was baby cages that would constrain babies at the same time as sort of air them out. So this baby cage is hanging from the outside of an apartment in a big city. So the 1920s saw the end of child labor, mandatory schooling was introduced even for the lower classes. There was a proliferation of child-rearing manuals, as I said, which heightened parental anxiety. There was more parental supervision than ever before, more intense moralizing, and more scheduling of children in some contexts, usually the middle and upper classes. There was also, however, at the same time, greater freedom for children to play in the 1920s. So children started to be targeted as consumers around 1900. The first comic books were released in the 20s. Children began choosing their own toys and entertainment, as opposed to adults choosing for them because they were being addressed as consumers. And here's an image of an ideal playroom for children from a 1920s householder magazine. And Elizabeth Bond Stockton, a queer theorist, writes, "The simple emergence in the 20s of children's playrooms and later rec rooms increased their interaction with media." I mean, even if the media were just comic books, increased their interaction with media and offered spaces where children could be alone or with each other. And Stockton writes, "One can imagine, though Stearns, who is a scholar who documented the 20s very carefully around these issues, one can imagine, though Stearns never mentions it, how crucial these trends turned out to be for children who thought they were gay or pursued sexual interests with each other." So there's something about the privacy and independence that children's playtime and playrooms afford and begin to afford in the 20s. So this is part of the legacy that my interviewees are inheriting. This is Catherine Bond Stockton's book, The Queer Child. Note that the subtitle is Growing Sideways in the 20th Century. That'll be more important later, that subtitle. So now we're jumping forward to the 1980s and 1990s, when there was a lot of discourse in the public sphere around fears over the quote unquote proto-gay child, the child that was in danger of becoming homosexual. And of course, there had always been those fears. But one thing that Stockton and other scholars have focused on is specifically the overlap with the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, with this fear around what are our children becoming? And this is a quote from Stockton: "The scope of institutions whose programmatic undertaking is to prevent the development of gay people is unimaginably large. Most sites of the state, the military, education, law, penal institutions, the church, medicine, and mass culture enforce it all but unquestioningly, and with little hesitation at even the recourse to invasive violence." And this is Stockton quoting a very famous theorist of the 80s and 90s, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. Around that time also, in the middle of 1995, separate from fears around the proto-gay child were fears of all children, any child, being exposed to pornography on the nascent internet. So at the time that this Time magazine cover came out, which says cyber porn exclusive, a new study shows how pervasive and wild it really is. Can we protect our kids and free speech? And this is a digitally rendered image of a little child who we assume has found cyber porn on his parents' computer and is horrified, or maybe intrigued, whatever you read into that expression. And so this fear that the internet was going to become a way that children could inappropriately access sexual content overlapped with those fears of the proto-gay child. Okay, we're going to move ahead a little bit to the mid-2000s, and this rhetoric that started in the middle of the 2000s continues to the present. This image, by the way, is from a Brazilian ad campaign against sexting. So the idea in this ad is that there's a young woman who's taking a topless selfie of herself in the mirror, but all of the people in the subsequent mirrors are accessing her naked body. So this ad campaign is about, you know, keep your private parts private, don't share don't sext out nude selfies of yourself to everybody. And so from the mid-2000s to the present, there has been this rhetoric about surveilling and shaming young people who engage with or produce or share sexual content on digital networks. There is this fear that is we still hear this, you know, in parenting groups today. What do we do about sexting? How can I get my kids to not do that, to not engage in these digital sexual practices? Also in the mid-2000s was the Motion Picture Association's launch of a major anti-piracy ad campaign. So this is a real advertisement. So this ad campaign was really famous. It was shown before movies in movie theaters. It was shown on TV. As soon as I pulled up just the first frame, Paris, sitting right here, said, I know this commercial really well. I know like every frame of it because it was so pervasive. And for a while, for about 5 or 7 years after this campaign started, copyright owners were suing individuals for really ridiculous reasons, for, you know, recording their kids singing happy birthday or dancing to a Prince song. And they got copyright holders, meaning the whole media industries, got so much bad press from their anti-piracy campaign that they ceased that. They stopped suing individuals because it just seemed so ridiculous. But it was a really intense moment of anti-piracy rhetoric and discourse spreading through, especially North America. Sorry, oops. So the historical context of Matt H's, Gilberto's, and Rex's use of pirate archives of queer porn in the late 2000s to mid-2010s consisted of these many rhetorical and discursive moves that were being made all around them, a big field of discourse, tension between being constrained and having freedom to play that had existed since at least the 1920s. There were widespread institutionalized fears over the proto-gay child since at least the 1980s. There was panic over children seeing porn online since the mid-1990s. There was panic over children sexting and other forms of digital sexual expression since the mid-2000s. And there were media industries warning fans to not violate copyright by pirating films and television series. So all of that informs my interviewees' adolescence, basically. In addition to all of those national and really widespread kinds of views that were circulating around the time of their tweenhood and teenhood, there was the interviewees' own understandings of restrictions and prohibitions on their media use, and also restrictions and prohibitions around their own queerness. So here are some quotes. This is from Matt H. I was on the East Coast in the South where it's like, yeah, it was dangerous for people to talk about it, meaning being gay, you know? And it still is in a way, but it's also so different. Where at this point, I just can't even believe that that's how it was only less than 15 years ago. He says, I feel like people are so much more accepting of it, meaning queerness, I guess. They know more about it. But it was frightening, especially for me, being this scared teenager in the South and having Asian parents who probably would not understand, and being from that kind of like traditional mindset. I was growing up and going through feelings of like, I'm not that. I'm not queer. I don't need to be queer. I can fix that. So that was Matt H's orientation in his adolescence. This is from Rex in China. I wouldn't say I already knew that I was gay, but somehow I knew that identity is attached or affiliated with shame, or I was not supposed to let others know. So I mostly kept that to myself and thought I shouldn't let other people know. I was hiding everything queer from my family, friends, and people in my school. And speaking of accessing any kind of gay content online, Rex said gay content may be deleted by the websites or by the censors of the content. This is from Gilberto. I'm from the South Bronx, so I'm from a predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood. I've always grown up around Caribbean people, and even though that is, of course, so integral to my personality, to my being, there was sort of like this slippage where I kind of went in one way and my culture went a different way. And I don't want to say that it's queerness because I do think that people kind of exceptionalize Caribbean queerness or like homophobia in the Caribbean. I think that people think it's like more homophobic than the United States, you know what I mean? But the United States is equally as homophobic. So Gilberto doesn't want to indict his own culture as super homophobic, more homophobic than all American culture, because he's saying all US culture is homophobic. But nevertheless, he is indicating he kind of went one way and his culture went a different way. All right. So prohibitions and restrictions on media and queerness associated with pervasive homophobia in US culture, in US Southern culture, in Asian American Pacific Islander culture, in Chinese culture, in Caribbean American culture. At the same time, my interviewees had freedom to play online. They had technological access and independence. They had their either access to their parents' computers, a shared family computer, or their own desktop computers in their own rooms, or a phone, a smartphone on which they could access social media. So this idea of constraint versus freedom dates, all the way back to the 1920s, when the 1920s saw this flaring up of rhetoric around needing to constrain children and prohibit them from certain things. But also the 1920s saw children gaining those spaces, that access to their own media, to their own choice making, which also leads to their explorations of their sexuality. In the conditions of social constraint and prohibition versus technological freedom, access, and independence, these individuals began practicing media piracy and found or made archives of queer porn. So this is from Matt H. In my teen years, maybe 14 or 15, I was interested in watching pornography, but I was like, where do I get it? Where do I find it? And especially queer pornography. So the internet actually was kind of useful for that because they have specific archives dedicated to gay porn. And he found, again, that torrent tracker that I will pseudonymize as Gay Porn Archive. And he says that archive is great because even though most of their content is gay porn, they have non-porn. They have television series even that are queer oriented. And the torrents were always up to date, very new things that are coming out. And all from mainly pay sites where one person would basically have a membership and then be that person who is distributing to everyone for free. This is from Rex. Sometime in middle school, I downloaded some pictures or videos of naked men to my computer. And this is my question. Were they men who were shirtless, men who were totally naked, men who were together? And Rex says all of those. And I asked, was it men actually performing sex acts? And Rex says there was one particular picture of that. And he says he downloaded the photos because those sites got censored so often. He says by which I think he means the queer sexual media ecology, was so fragile. And I thought if I downloaded them, I will have them forever. Okay, this is from Gilberto. I didn't name the archive that Matt H used, but I will name Tumblr as the site where Gilberto accessed queer porn, because since Tumblr's 2018 ban on pornography, it's actually really difficult to use Tumblr the same way that Gilberto used it in 2014. So I think it's fine to name it explicitly. So Gilberto said, Tumblr was the first place I saw gay porn, which was a super monumental moment in my life. And it matters that it was nothing that I actually searched for, but something that came up on my dashboard, you know what I mean? Because it was the only way I could have done it. I would never have Googled gay porn for the first time, you know what I mean? It had to come up naturally, yeah. Gilberto says, I never questioned piracy on Tumblr. This was me asking, do you think that gay porn that you saw was pirated and posted on Tumblr? And Gilberto said, I never questioned piracy on Tumblr, because piracy is like Tumblr's domain. Like, you know what I mean? Like, Tumblr exists because of that, meaning because of piracy. And because it was kind of low key at the time, we were outside of the legal, you know what I mean? Like, Tumblr was its own virtual kind of whirlwind. I was just like, yeah, so this is what gay sex is, you know what I mean? Like, on a very basic level, this is what it is. This is what you are able to do. Because again, I also didn't know what the fuck sex was, one. And two, I especially didn't know what the fuck gay sex was. You know what I mean? Like, that has its own thing. Like, I was watching this for the first time and being like, wow, a penis can go inside an anus. Like, that is literally crazy. That was absurd to me. So before young queer people in the late 2000s to mid 2010s began practicing media piracy to find queer porn, they already felt their developing desires and orientation to be illicit and had to be kept secret and hidden. They already felt their queerness put them at risk of being outside or in conflict with their national or ethnic or geographic cultures and societies. They already sensed or saw that other teenagers' digital expressions of sex were heavily surveilled and treated as violations of norms and policies, and that they bore a similar stigma of criminality as the very pedophiles that parents feared were preying on them. So somehow children's sexuality and people who were preying on children sexually became sort of equated. The children themselves were treated sort of as pseudo-criminals. They also already sensed they were departing from putatively, quote unquote, straightforward sexual development, that they were, in Stockton's words, growing sideways, that they were coming of age queerly. And I argue this all means that, in other words, they were primed to align with piracy. Now, this idea that queer youth identify with pirates is an old idea from literary studies. It comes from this idea that queer media use for young people means often an identification with outsider figures. Dallas J. Baker, in a 2015 article, argues that these deep and long-running associations in the popular imaginary between abjection and queerness set up LGBTQ+ readers and viewers to identify with certain types of archetypical characters: the monstrous characters, the criminal characters, the murderous, the marginalized, the demonized, the rebellious, and the deviant. This is because Baker's referring to the fact that in a lot of, for example, 19th century Victorian literature, these monstrous, criminal, demonized, rebellious characters seem to be subtextually coded as queer. So when queer students are assigned these kinds of canonical novels and they read about these murderous or demonized, rebellious characters, they sense this affinity between possibly their own queerness and the hidden or subtextual queerness of these characters. So pirates fit several of these categories at once. And I want to also note that around this time that Matt H. and Rex and Gilberto were coming of age, there was a global blockbuster franchise featuring an apparently queer pirate hero. And that the growth of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise completely overlaps with the younger millennials and Gen Z's coming of age. Also, that tie between queerness and piracy in mass media also has its own long history. We see these kinds of homosocial pirates that are framed in these slashy ways, as fans would say, starting in the 1930s. This is a famous film called Captain Blood, starring Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone, and they're in these billowing shirts against this backdrop of these cresting waves, dueling each other with, fencing with swords to the death. Errol Flynn wins. That's from the 1930s. This is a Burt Lancaster movie from the 1950s called The Crimson Pirate, and not only are all the pirates shirtless almost the whole movie and entirely homosocial throughout, but at one point they're in drag. So it is really quite a queer film. And that has continued into the 2010s. There was this terrific show called Black Sails on the Starz network that was all about pirates, both historical and fictional. And there were canonical queer characters in that show. So this top image is of this poly queer trio, and this bottom picture is of two male characters, Lord Thomas Hamilton and the man who would become the pirate captain named Flint. And so queerness in piracy started to be, was at first kind of implicit in Hollywood productions and then became pretty explicit in the 2010s. And that has continued onto social media. This is an image of the pirate flag flying above the rainbow flag, and this is by a Black Sails fan. But nevertheless, this is a great, whether you think about Black Sails, the TV show, or not, this is a great caption. I went on photography adventures today, and then shows the pirate flag flying over the rainbow flag, as it should be. And here's another image from Twitter. This image was from Tumblr, and this image is from Twitter. The Soviet Onion tweets, I beckon you to remember there was no such thing as a straight pirate. So there are queer fans that have long been interested in and still are interested in this kind of intrinsic tie between piracy and queerness. Okay, and then to take it another direction, I want to talk about what my interviewees are not doing. They're not allowing themselves to become what Michel Foucault would call docile bodies. Docile bodies, Foucault said, are bodies that can be trained. And this is an image from Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish. It's an illustration from a 1749 orthopedics manual in France. And this image, which is of a bent tree, quote unquote, growing sideways tree that is being straightened out, this image is an image from this book that is about children who are deformed and whose limbs need to be straightened. So this image is a kind of metaphor, kind of symbolic representation of a child who is growing sideways and somehow needs to be straightened out, quote unquote, with orthopedic armature. And so Foucault uses this image to talk about what happens to children and children's bodies when they are treated as docile bodies, bodies that can be shaped, bodies that can be formed, bodies that can be made to grow in whatever direction the society tells them to grow. And I argue that instead of being docile bodies subjected to straightening when growing sideways, Matt H. and Rex and Gilberto went online and found a culture that defined itself by its sidewaysness. That is, by queerness as well as by lateral peer-to-peer sharing through the BitTorrent protocol. So next to the image of the tree being straightened is this lateral image of how peer-to-peer sharing through BitTorrent works, which is that every computer shares with every other. It's a deliberate sideways maneuver, not a top-down distribution model. Okay, so I want to characterize Matt H's, Rex's, and Gilberto's affect in finding these pirate archives as euphoric, as a kind of archival euphoria, similar to gender euphoria experienced by some trans and non-binary people when they have powerfully positive experiences of gender. So this, what I call archival euphoria, is akin to the fan's enthusiasm upon finding a whole archive of fan works that they can consume comprehensively in order to acculturate themselves to a new fandom community. So if you've ever gone on Tumblr in a certain hashtag, or if you've ever gone to Archive of Our Own or any other fanfiction.net or any other big fan archives, and you look for the show or the film or the comic book or the game that you're currently really into, you'll find a whole subsection of fan works devoted to your favorite thing. And I interviewed for my previous book lots of fans who would find these archives when they were new to a fandom, and then basically like consume everything in it in order to understand like what are the fans interested in, what is the argot, how do I talk about this community, you know, how do I speak with this community. So I think of archival euphoria as experienced by my interviewees as similar to this fanish enthusiasm. And it's the opposite of archival dysphoria. It's opposite of experiences of archives as dry, dusty, stale, state-controlled bodies of information with which one is required to interact. And these archives that individuals find or create are full of material that they find inspirational and pleasurable that may allow them entree to a community that resonates with their sense of self or teaches them about themselves, who they are or who they are becoming. Here's Rex talking about his archival euphoria. He says, searching for images of men online was basically the starting stage of my exploration. It was just me being a strong researcher. It was exploration, and sometime during my grade 12, I completed my exploration. I officially recognized that part of myself, meaning the queer part of him, and accepted that. This is Gilberto. I was just like, yeah, so this is what gay sex is, you know what I mean? This, like on a very basic level, this is what it is. This is what you are able to do. I didn't enter Tumblr neutrally, you know. I had already at this age experienced sexual assault. I had already been racialized. I had already been aware of my body in a way I didn't feel comfortable with, which is probably why I felt so far away from it, meaning his body. So I think that seeing queer porn on Tumblr brought me a little bit closer to my body, but it also kind of just showed me a different way that sex can happen. Yeah. Like I thought that violent assault was the most you could do. I thought it was gay sex. Boy, was I wrong. After being assaulted, I was like, no, this is not it for me. And I think that finding something else on Tumblr was finding that kind of showed me that I wanted something else, if that makes sense. And this is Matt H. I don't really remember how I stumbled upon it, but I remember finding it and just being like, this is the best thing ever. He says, one of the things that I like about the GPA site so much is that there's everything. And the media files are categorized very well too. Like a lot of the categories will be like twink, hunk, interracial. You know, you can have just blowjobs if you want. You can have transgender, and it's all just there. I remember when I was young and getting on the site, I didn't know for sure if I was queer. I was like, maybe this is just a phase, you know? So I watched everything. That was my way of being like, that's interesting, but that's not for me. Or I kind of do like this. And you know, using what turns me on to know more about myself and what I want. And I said, so seeing everything helped you articulate maybe to yourself your own desires. And Matt said, exactly. So what I'm calling queer self-making is both a performance against heteronormativity and a performance of self. So what do I mean by performance against heteronormativity? I'll just quote one of the interviewees here, Rex. Rex says, my parents found out about his queer porn archive, and I was terrified. I think at that time it was like, I didn't really know what it was, meaning what queerness was, or whether he was gay or not. So when they asked me, I didn't really know myself. It was pretty serious. My parents were pretty shocked, angry. My mom was crying really hard. I was terrified. When I went into the room, meaning when Rex's parents wanted to talk to him about the photographs on the family computer, he says, the whole vibe was different. Like, what is this vibe? There was one particular picture of men having sex, and they saw that. After that happened, of course, I knew I had to disguise this downloading practice even better. And I don't even know whether that was conscious or subconscious. So this was a deliberate action that Rex had to take in order to keep pirating queer porn. He had to really decide that in a way that went against, obviously, his parents' wishes, which I consider to be a performance against heteronormativity. And so this performance against heteronormativity is also a performance of the queer self. Baker, citing Judith Butler, says, Butler argues that an experience of an alternate or different subjectivity can, quote, undo a prior conception of who one is, only to inaugurate a relatively newer one. In the context of queer theory, this process of undoing and or reconstituting subjectivities is an act of resistance against heteronormativity. This process of undoing, in which new subjectivities emerge, can be described as a queering of the self or as a queer self-making. So, my argument for the last half of this presentation has been that archival euphoria leads to a performance against norms. For my interviewees, it's a performance against heteronormativity and a performance of self. And this sequence leads me to have a lot of questions around media literacy. Because what do we mean by media literacy? There are a lot of young people like Matt H. and Rex and Gilberto who found themselves online through pirated archives of media in a really great way, a really positive experience of archival euphoria. But I also think in this age of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, we see tons of people also experiencing archival euphoria on the internet, who perform against norms, who feel like they're performing themselves, and it doesn't have that positive effect on society. It has quite negative effects. So part of me wonders, what is the difference between the archival euphoria of my queer interviewees and the archival euphoria of flat earthers, or of anti-vaxxers, or of people who start to believe in conspiracy theories? And I want to call attention to this quote that Foucault includes in his essay on self-writing by Seneca, a Roman Stoic philosopher. Seneca says, "From the many things which I have read, I claim some part for myself." And I think that's such an important quotation for this era in which we have to rethink media literacy anew. Because media literacy is a lot more than being able to decode or understand the message of a particular TikTok video, Snapchat video, piece of popular music. Media literacy is really about what parts, beyond understanding the meaning of a piece of media, what parts do you claim for yourself from that piece of media? What do you allow into your system? What do you allow to change you? How do people decide what parts of the many things they see online on licit and illicit sites to claim for themselves? So I'll leave you with that larger question. Thank you so much for having me today. This is my Twitter handle, by the way.
That's exciting. Thank you so much. So usually we get into a whole bunch of questions now, and you may raise your hand and request a microphone, as we well know. And well, maybe I'll start off with a question, which is, how is an archive creative?
Yeah.
And just looking up something, is that a creative act, or just putting something into an archive or building an archive? Are those creative acts? And how does that lead? I can see that self-making is very creative, but how does that resonate with the creativity in an archive?
Oh, that's such a lovely question. In my last book, Rogue Archives, I interviewed and write about many people who founded their own fan archives and pirate archives, and as Greg said, other kinds of underground archives. And it requires so much creativity, so much dedication, real passion, devotion and care, and also technical brilliance. And also sometimes a lot of money. I mean, people, which, amateur archivists are happy to spend because they say hobbies require money, but it is quite an intensive amateur art practice, I think. It's also quite a gift to a whole community. to take on the role and responsibility of opening an archive and maintaining it, that is in essence a role you accept or you assign yourself forever for the rest of your life. People that give up their archives that can't steward it anymore actually have to either find a successor, or now thankfully they can donate. In the fandom community, you can donate your archive to organization of transformative works through a program called Open Doors. So you can give it to a community, not to keep growing your archive, but at least just to record it, to preserve it in a static form. So it is quite an undertaking for people to open archives, and I really just, I think much, much more of amateur archivists in a way than I do of people that maintain archives for a living, because it's so much more willed, and it's also, they don't have to, but they just choose to do that. People who do get paid to maintain a really cool archive for a living are the Internet Archive people, and that is based in San Francisco. Greg has spoken at lots of Internet Archive events, so if you want to see a really broad, cool, free archive, digital archive at work, you should go to archive.org and look for that organization's parties and events and listings and stuff. They also have a bar in Fort Mason, I think that's still there, called the Long Now Bar. And that's a really cool project that kind of started as an amateur archive, but then its founder, Brewster Kahle, started to fund it for real. So now it has funding and employees and that kind of thing. But that's an example of like an amateur archive initiative that grew so big and so relevant that it became a kind of professional career for some people. But thank you so much for that question.
You're welcome. And let's go a little deeper into the subject matter here. So is anybody ready to jump in? Yes, go ahead.
So I saw that all the interviewees that we heard from today, they all identified as male, and I was wondering if you found any different results or discovering different results with people who were not explicitly male or women.
Yeah. My last book was about fans, mostly queer female fans. So I don't think there is such a divide along gender lines between people that consume porn in written form versus, like erotica, versus people who consume porn as like a visual medium, like in films. But I will say that in my interviewing, it did break down like that. Lots of I would say all of the female identified people would talk freely about reading erotic fan fiction or those kinds of genres, romance novels. One non-binary person did talk about watching porn, and almost all of my male interviewees talked about accessing porn at some point in their growing up. So I would welcome thoughts on what that gender divide is about. I mean, it might be around female identifying people growing up with some kind of shame around, I don't know, watching visual porn or something. I'm not really sure. But yeah, I know that it happens. Linda Williams, a famous porn studies scholar who was on faculty at UC Berkeley for many years, wrote quite a lot about porn. And from her scholarship, I know that women watch porn, but I don't know why my female identifying interviewees wouldn't talk about that as freely, or maybe didn't see it as part of their self-making. I think it could really be that if they did see porn as videos, it maybe just didn't have the same impact on them. So yeah, I'm open to suggestions about that, but thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much. I also kind of wanted to add on to what you said about suggestions as to why porn may not be as impactful for queer women, and as a queer woman myself. I think one part in it has to do with the fact that a lot of lesbian porn tends to be created for men or for the male gaze.
Yeah.
So a lot of the time it's not very impactful, and I think it also kind of creates a more layered reaction as to how women perceive their bodies and their queerness and sex with another woman. That's just something that I wanted to add on to with that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I believe that argument. I think that's convincing. I also, some of my female interviewees for the last book talked quite at length about the impact of same-sex erotica on them. So, like, that written form may be more by women for women readers, and there's lots of, probably identifiable, but also kind of affect, like sort of ineffable sorts of like the feel of it, the tone of it is just more appropriate and more, yeah, more impactful, more suitable for the readership. So yeah, I think there is something different going on in literary production versus video production. I think that makes a lot of sense.
There's a question in the chat.
Yes, please bring it up.
Okay. Eric Ron asks, or says, thank you so much for the talk. You touched the parallel between the sideways sharing of peer-to-peer networking and queer play. Do you think the more queer-to-queer online sharing of queer pornography enables an especially or structurally different thing than previous forms of sharing? I could imagine that finding pre-internet print queer pornography could be a similar experience of archive euphoria, and that media might be similarly passed around through semi-anonymous networks. Is this an analog parallel to what we see now, or do you think peer-to-peer torrenting is radically different?
Oh, that is such a great question. And Jacqueline, you said queer to queer at one point. Were you reading what the student wrote, or was that your own, generative misreading?
Peer-to-peer.
Uh-huh. I'm gonna use queer to queer.
Okay.
I think that's such a cool détournement of peer to peer. You know, for sure, we always see in every part of history, at least since the 18th century, a lot of peer to peer sharing of pornography, a lot of peer to peer sharing of illicit materials and of queer materials, and we see this in France in the libertine era, and we see this, in the Soviet Union. There was something called samizdat, which was illegal publishing, in which basically artists would put a bunch of different works into an envelope and just share the envelopes around with all of their friends, so that it wasn't ever published, or if it was published, there were only 7 copies, which I think was the limit of self-publishing you could do under the Soviet Union. So there were lots and lots of systems that people have always found for peer-to-peer sharing of illicit or censored material. I think what is different in the digital era is the scale of it, where peer-to-peer sideways sharing, queer-to-queer sharing, can be so widespread. And also, a quote I didn't include from Matt H. was about his hesitation around hard copy materials. So that would have included even magazines, but for sure DVDs or Blu-rays. His fear was that he could be caught with that material. So hard copies have a kind of tangibility, the tangibleness, this weightiness to them that seems undeniable, whereas digital material seems, to be frank, more easily like cached and hidden, but also more easily deleted, perhaps, if discovery is imminent or is looming. So there is something special about digital peer-to-peer that is really different than, like, if an artist got caught with a samizdat envelope, they could be subject to a lot of kinds of punishment, at the least interrogation, but also possibly house arrest, and also possibly things like being banned from jobs having to do with art. Being caught with physical materials is quite serious. And I think there's something about the digital, the lightness and immateriality of the digital, that whether it's true or not, it's less risky. I think that there is something about that medium that allows young people to feel less at risk. So I think there is a question, though, is that less risky? Rex got caught with his digital material. And at the same time, by the way, Rex's parents, when they found the pornography in his computer, assumed that a bad friend had sent it to him. They assumed it was not his material. So they went into denial mode right away with that material, and just kind of told him, "Oh, you must have made you made friends with a terrible person on the internet. They sent you all these dirty pictures. That was wrong." That was their story. I'm not sure what Rex said in response to that. I think he denied that it was some bad friend. but didn't quite take full ownership of downloading the material either. He sort of walked that line between, did I get this or did somebody send it to me? So I think that there are affordances with digital peer-to-peer-ing that are that seem really light, less risky, more private. And then I think we would have to question, is that really the case? But the scale is undeniable, I think. The fact that thousands or millions of people can find each other on the internet faster than, we could imagine, like maybe hundreds of people could share pornography in France in the 18th century. So now we have thousands, millions of people sharing it on the network. Thank you.
There's more questions online too, but if
In-person questions? No, I have a burning question too, but I'm not sure how to ask it exactly. Should we do that? And so I'm wondering, kind of going back to the earlier question about lesbian porn, and porn is part of what generally people consider love, but love is much broader. And so how has the section of porn become so exponential in terms of helping these the people that you mentioned make themselves? Could there be other paths and tools where we discover our identity that have more to do with love and less with porn specifically?
Yeah, I mean, romance novels are both, I would say. The genre of romance novel is sort of, the whole thing is about love, the whole genre, but then one of the really appealing parts about it is the sex, is the porn. So yeah, I think that I wouldn't count out the love part of the emotional part of the equation from the kinds of videos and images that the interviewees were watching. I think that it's certainly, even though they talk about the sexual nature of the content, I think they're implying something bigger. I think they're implying that through these depictions of men having sex with each other, they are getting a sense of a whole world, a world in which they could imagine themselves having relationships, not just like hooking up with other men, but they can imagine stepping into the position of an adult who, for example, is out and can hold hands with another man walking down the street or something like that. And I should say that all three of these individuals are out now, and I don't want to imply there's something negative or wrong with not coming out, because that is a very legitimate way to orient yourself too sexually. But in the sort of life narrative of these three interviewees, they all did come out, and I would say on the, at the cusp of teenagehood and like their 20s. I'd say like that's around the period, that's around the ages that they chose to come out. And I think their self-making through these porn archives was a big part of that. So I think while the archives are archives of porn, I think it was a more expansive worldview that they were able to imagine through what they were seeing.
So porn was the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, exactly. And as Matt H. says, there was a lot more in the porn archive than just porn. So even just the adjacent files of watching, the first round of the L Word or the British version of Queer as Folk, I think those kinds of media titles also depict these much larger worlds.
All right, back to, I see a question up there, yeah. And then back to the online questions.
Hi, first off, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to kind of tag along to the discussion on like gay media, if that's okay. I was specifically thinking about the topic of like television, mostly because I was thinking about queer novels versus like queer television versus like queer porn. And the one thing that I kind of thought about is like often in queer television, there's not like the best depictions.
Yeah.
Like legitimately last night, my roommate and I were talking about watching something. They wanted to watch something like queer based, right? And they mentioned a movie and I was like, does it end up with the two characters, they were female presenting, and like, does it end up with them dead, straight again, or in a mentally incarcerated? And they were like, and I was like, then we're not watching it. That's and right. I feel like one reason possibly that I feel like your argument makes sense is because if you want like a visual representation of something positive, you're not going to find it in the media, and you may more so find it in novels or in like I don't personally consume porn, but from your presenting, that's like the two kind of mediums where you can see that. So I just wanted to know your thoughts, and that's something that was kind of bubbling with me as you discussed.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I do think that relates to Baker's argument around the monstrous, the murderous, the villainous, and a lot of novels in the 19th century and continuing today and media forms today, the characters who are explicitly or implicitly queer have to be punished somehow or another by the end. So by the end, as you say, it's like they can have these moments of happiness or joy or love, connection, but somehow at the end, like you kind of implied, one of them goes back to their husband or whatever. She might be sad, but she's gonna do it, for the sake of the kids or whatever it is. And or one of the characters might die, or one of the characters might go crazy. And so there's a lot of that traditionally in Western fiction. And that's why there is this identification that a lot of queer young people tend to have with people that read as criminals or as crazy or as, twisted in some way, because they sense, oh, those are the queer characters, or that's what always happens to the queer characters. That's why I think that's one case I'm trying to make of why piracy is not a big deal. In this case, because to be pirate, to defy these norms around copyright is just another version of the message that queer kids often get, which is like, you just have to go against a lot. You have to go against tropes, norms, genre conventions, the law in some cases, so your parents' policies or whatever it is. So I think that there is this resonance between outsiderness and being a queer kid for the very reasons that you're talking about. But I think that what you're saying about, mass media really failing on these points is legit. And things like novels, memoirs, graphic novels are much, the artist has much more control over what happens to characters in those settings, and they're not trying to fall into these major conventions, these tropes that they know play to millions of people. They're not trying to find that kind of audience, and they're not trying to be within those formats. So I do think there is a lot more freedom in more avant-garde or, just smaller works, more artistic works, sort of explicitly labeled as such. I also think fan works are one of the places we see this the most, because in fan works where people basically often queer characters who are straight on the screen, I think that is such an important move, because that doesn't require that you turn into some great literary artist who gets agented and published, and your amazing, queer fiction or memoir finds its audience of 300 people. That's not what happens in online fan communities. In online fan communities, you can basically watch a TV show about two cops, slash them or queer them in your story, publish it the same night the episode airs, basically, find an audience of like 5,000 to 5,000 readers instantly. Nobody gets paid, but everybody sort of gets rewarded. Everybody feels like, oh yeah, that is the version of that cop show I would have wanted to see, is where those two guys who are both like really hot, have the hots for each other and go off and ride into the sunset as a loving couple. Like, I think that move, which maybe doesn't seem like an artistic move, is a move of basically working on and customizing these mass products, these mass media, formats like television shows, and saying, I'm gonna make this work for me. This was made for millions of people, but I'm gonna make it work for just me, But in transforming mass products into something more customized for a unique sensibility, people do reach audiences. They do find, oh, that version is really popular. The queer Marvel universe has millions of fans. People would love to see Marvel be super queer. And it just never is, So I think that fan works and really explicitly artistic works are both good places good models for how people can kind of reckon with and push against mass media's failings on these scores. So thank you.
Oh, so beautifully said. There we have it. Versioning as a creative strategy. I think that's exactly what we're after. And that's why we're going to do these drawings, copies of masterworks, in the museum, and we're
Yes,
going to version them
fanworks.
and fan works and turn them into yeah, we're going to version them, and that's exactly the practice we're after. So
Right.
thanks for laying that out so beautifully. Any more questions from online?
Questions here. I love this question. What are your thoughts around the pirate being used by both queer folks and straight capitalist techies?
Yes, totally. I do have to reckon with the kind of techno-libertarian love of piracy. I know that I do. And what can I say? You know, my interviews focused on users, pirates, who are not kind of the normative tech bros that we, you know, that populate Silicon Valley. I mean, I think that just just like the people that my team chose to interview makes it a different project than a techno-libertarian project. But I fully admit tons of people that come out in defense of media piracy are completely a certain kind of Silicon Valley tech bro. Like, that's absolutely the case. And I wish I could be really utopian about it and say all the queer and black and brown people are going to make common cause with their tech brothers and all take up arms to free the internet and, you know, change how copyright works. I wish that were the case, but I just don't think that's probably going to happen. I will say that one thing I like about piracy is that it's a very, if it is a political movement, like if you see it that way, it's a very lean one. It's a very light one. Like, fandom is much heavier by comparison, you know? Piracy is, I would say, the valence of most politics is really hot, and the valence of piracy is very cool. Pirates don't talk to each other. They don't really have a ton of community per se. Like, actually, Matt H's archive did have forums and was the most community I've ever heard of in a pirate group. Mostly pirates just trade, you know, pure trade, which is why the techno-libertarians love it, because it's like the closest they can get to that Adam Smith marketplace, that free and open marketplace. Very little money is exchanged, but lots of goods are exchanged, and there are rules around those exchanges. Often you often have to give away as much media as you pull down, you know, as you download. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why free market type people really love it, but there's lots of reasons why marginalized people really love it also, sort of people that have more socialist ideals. And the reason they can coexist in the pirate marketplace is that they don't talk to each other. So I think that lack of sociality actually has something. There's something about just how if you just agree on infrastructure and protocol, you don't have to say a goddamn thing to anybody else. And I don't know if there's a lesson in there for politics in general, because I don't think politics in general can work like that. Like, civics can't work like that. But somehow piracy does work like that. I'm going to keep asking myself that question, you know, of like, is there an application of the coolness and lightness and prevalent silence around pirate interaction? Is there a lesson there for real politics or not? Could we imagine a town hall where it's like, we just do, we don't talk, you know? But the doing is about sharing. The doing is like, all we do is we give stuff away, and we just make sure that if you take stuff, you also give stuff away. That's the rule of pirate communities. So I don't know if we can establish that in real politics, so to speak. But I know that's why people of such differing political views can all be pirates and all love piracy. That's a great question. Thank you so much.
That was a great answer too. Thank you. Any more?
There are some more questions. Also, I just wanted to say I loved your talk, and I loved like getting words to start thinking about the ways in which that I've also formed my identity using media and searched for images of women of color or like my fellow disabled peers, and like how that I never really thought of this like archival euphoria of like finding these other people that also have like an identity that I can share and build upon. So I really appreciated
Oh, thank you.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Yvonne Gonzalez asks, a lot of contemporary debates in erotica and porn surround fetishization. What is the line between healthy exploration and fetishization, and does that tie into identity?
Yeah, Yvonne. I know Yvonne. Hi, Yvonne. Yeah, I think that is such a good question about like, it's almost like a mental health question, you know? When you think about self-making through online archival euphoria, like you were alluding to, Jacqueline, it's like, what makes that a healthy self-making as opposed to an unhealthy self-making? And that is kind of my last question, you know, around media literacy. What parts of which is, I mean, when we think about fetish, by the way, when we think about Freud's concept of fetish, it is about parts standing for the whole. It is about the foot becoming the sex organ, or the foot standing in for, you know, in Freud's case, the entire woman. So it is about what parts do we fetishize, you know, to use Yvonne's terminology. Like, what parts do we fetishize to the point that they become ourselves, that we decide to make that media a part of the story we tell about ourselves, that we decide to make that media, to allow that media to kind of shape the next step of our lives, or shape the next shape that our self takes. I think these are such important questions, and I don't know the answer, but I know that when we talk about children's interactions with media, and when we talk about media literacy, we're not usually talking about these questions. We are kind of, as a society, we're more talking about constraint, like having a way to police what children access, making sure they cannot access the entire archive, limiting their screen time, limiting what they can do on the computers, or monitoring it, or putting up, you know, the YouTube parental kind of restrictions. But I don't think those mechanisms, those technological solutions, are really working very well. First of all, there is, you know, global piracy, so young people are going to find those kinds of media no matter what. But also, constraint exists, coincides with this open field of play, this technological access, and this freedom. So that's another reason the constraint doesn't work. And of course, young people will only go towards the things they're told not to. So there's lots of reasons why I don't think there's a mechanical solution to shaping young people to be mentally healthy, to have this mentally well relationship to media. Rather, I think we need to focus as a society much more on, like, Seneca's question. From the many things which I have read, I claim some part for myself. Let's focus on what are people doing with the media that they take in. How are they processing those images, those sounds, those words? What sense, what selves are they making with that media? That, to me, is where to is by far the most productive, much more generative area to investigate. And this question of, like, how can we constrain children's access to media? So yeah, Yvonne, totally. that is the question. How can we have a mentally healthy, how can we be mentally well and interact with media, and hopefully interact with media in a way that increases our wellness and our health, rather than, you know, just assuming it always decreases our wellness and health, but also knowing it really can. Media really can decrease our mental wellness and health too, and does in many cases. So what's going on in that interaction?
Be a really wonderful question for us to run a whole course on, and a great note to end your beautiful lecture on, and
Great.
very thought-provoking lecture on. It was really compelling, and please join me in a round of applause for Gail De Kosnik.
Thank you.